Here I went to the World Social Forum in Caracas, and that turned me around quite a bit. Because I realized that what was happening in Latin America was not just happening in Bolivia. I'd written a book called Imagine Democracy in 2000 about the participatory budget, but there was something really very profound happening in Latin America. And in this particular discussion I went to, they said we are on the offensive against neoliberalism, which was really quite impressive. And the debate was incredible. I mean, it was wide-ranging, and again, it was respectful. It went everything from, you know, someone who had a sort of traditional Marxist-Leninist insurrectionary position to economists from Mexico who said, you know, political parties were archaic and we had to let them behind, and it was all grassroots and so on and so forth. And yet there was no denouncing, there was nothing like that. It was really an attempt to come to grips with how to create alternatives and not just defeat neoliberalism, which they were sure they could do, but how to create transformational alternatives. I decided to go to Bolivia, and the reason I decided to go to Bolivia was I went to it's complicated. I went to Jordan to work with Iraqi social movements to talk to them about feminism. And the woman who invited me is named Susan Harvey, and she lived 9 years in Bolivia. She knows she knows Evo and all the mass. She spent 9 years hiding them from the police. And she talked to me about Bolivia. And at the end of her talk, I decided this is where I have to start my journey. And I went to Bolivia in June 2006. And I can honestly say it literally blew my mind. You know, we use that expression from the 60s. It literally blew my mind.
Today, Bolivia has over 9 million inhabitants and has the second largest deposits of natural gas in South America. Yet, Bolivia is the second poorest country in the hemisphere, second only to Haiti.
Every person I talked to, I interviewed, and I was lucky enough to be able to interview Evo Morales as well as many of his ministers. Every person I talked to, I ended the interview and I thought, I have to think about that. I have to think about it. I didn't fully understand what they were talking about. But over time I came to understand better that here was a movement, it was in government, but it was a movement that was working from a deep value base of a combination of Andean philosophy and Andean ideas and what I would consider to be the best of the left. Based on a very militant political tradition, Bolivia is like the most political place on earth. Like the minute you get out of the taxi driver is giving you an analysis of the conjuncture. Everybody knows everything that's happening, they have opinions about everything that's happening, and they discuss it all the time. I stayed with a working class family that had the TV on all the time. On the news. It was always on the news. The only thing I watched was the news and The Simpsons. But I was there at an amazing time. It was 6 months after the MAS had been elected, and it was the opening of the Constituent Assembly. Evo said what the Constituent Assembly would do would be to refound Bolivia as a non-neoliberal, non-colonial state. And the more that you talk to people in Latin America, the more I learned about Latin America, the more I talked to indigenous people in Latin America, the more I realized that one of the most powerful movements that are happening today in the Americas in general, but most powerfully in Latin America right now, is the rise of indigenous people. And the MAS is in the head of that, because at a certain point they decided that protest was no longer enough, resistance was no longer enough, they had to take power. And Evo says taking government is not taking power, taking government is just a step, and that we have to build power from the bottom up. And all of what he does, all of what they've done in government is is consequent with that idea. And the MAS itself is not a political party. They call it a political instrument of the social organizations. So it's basically, if you're a member of an indigenous social organization, you're a member of the MAS. You're a member of a campesino social organization, you're a member of the MAS. And then they included urban activists, intellectuals, union activists, and so on.
The indigenous majority feel that the new constitution has at its core a plurinational communitarian vision, a step towards the decolonization of Bolivia that for centuries has discriminated and marginalized them.
The thing that struck me is the number of campesinos that were always in the government offices. Like it's just, you know, we heard here that the first indigenous president in the Americas was elected, but it's not just an indigenous president, it's an indigenous government. The vice president's not indigenous, but pretty well everybody else is, all the deputy ministers, and all of them have office hours every day so that campesinos can come because they don't have phones. They come and they wait to see the minister. And they have office hours so people who just show up and sitting on the floor in the offices can see the minister. And I was sitting there waiting for somebody one day, and this young man was there, and he was waiting, and he said to me, "Why are you here? Why did you come?" And I said, "Well, I'm very interested in democracy, and I think that what you're doing here is a really interesting experiment in democracy." And he said, "Yes, we know a lot about democracy in Bolivia. The problem is that our governments don't." And then he said, "But we're hoping this one will be different." And indeed, this one has been very different. In fact, Chomsky was on Democracy Now! A day before yesterday, Noam Chomsky, and he said Bolivia is the most democratic country in the world. And I think that's very true.
We are sure that this constitution contains what the Bolivian people would like to have. First, the natural resources must be state property. The water is a fundamental right, as a human right that cannot be turned into a business for a few businessmen, especially when, soon in this world, water will be a scarce resource. The next topic, there can't be a country where many nationalities coexist with their own cultures to make them disappear. This constitution recognizes respect and gives priority to these indigenous people and native peoples.
So, building on a history of militant struggle, they had a phenomenal labor movement in the mines throughout the 80s. That was defeated in the 80s by neoliberalism, by a threatened massacre. So they were threatened. They did a demonstration. One of the things about Bolivia is it's very mountainous. So there's one intersection. If you shut it down, you shut down the country. And so and so they shut down that intersection, and then the troops surrounded them. This was the Marcha de la Vida, it was called, and they decided to retreat. And it was a big defeat for the miners. And that is when Evo and the coca farmers and the indigenous people really moved in a big way into the labor movement. They're already in it. They moved in a big way, and the changes started to happen. Many of you might be aware of the struggle in '92 against water privatization in Cochabamba. It's the one that we're most aware of. But it was followed by a struggle of the coca farmers against the attempt to wipe out coca, the growing of coca by the U.S. To try and end the cocaine trade. But wiping out coca because you want to end the cocaine trade is like banning the growing of grapes during the Prohibition. Because coca is a sacred plant to the indigenous people of that region. It's great for what ails you. It's kind of, I always think of it as the chicken soup of the Andean indigenous people because it's good for really lots of things. And that struggle that took place, and then the most brutal was the gas wars, which is an attempt to fight against further privatization of gas and oil, where 20 people, I think, or how many people were killed? 70 people were killed, I think.
70 and hundreds were wounded.
Right.
Hundreds
in
only 2 days.
Yeah.